From now until Palm Sunday, we're going to be all about Chad Myers and Binding the Strong Man. All about his interpretation of the section of the gospel from Caesarea Philippi until he moves into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, until Jesus does. And during that period of time, Jesus predicts his crucifixion and resurrection 3 times, always resisted by the disciples. That would be us, the disciples, the followers of Jesus, always resisted. And it goes in a pattern. The section starts with the story about a healing of a blind man, and then Peter tells Jesus, when Jesus asks him, "Who am I?" "You are the Messiah." And immediately following that, Jesus says, "I'm going to be crucified." Then there's a story about blindness, and then there's a teaching. In this case, it's a teaching about political power. And then a paradox. You have to, in order to save your life, you have to lose it. In the next cycle, from Galilee to Judea, Jesus again predicts his crucifixion. Again, there's a story of blindness following it, or some reference to it. And then again, teaching, in this case, teaching what the way of the cross would mean for a community of followers of Jesus. And finally, the last one. Again, Jesus predicts. Again, there's a reference to blindness. And then Jesus speaks to the issue of leadership in the community. We have greatest. In order to be greatest, you have to be least. And I forgot. In order to be first, you have to be last. And finally, it finishes with another story of the blind man. Isn't it amazing he sat around and figured that out? In any case, we'll be covering those stories, talking about what the way of the cross is about from now till Palm Sunday, when we will hear the challenge at the end of the gospel. But for now, I would like to read you the 3 predictions of crucifixion that Jesus gave to his disciples. Would you listen as the Spirit brings a word to you through these extraordinarily challenging texts? Following Peter's expression that he was the Messiah, Jesus began to teach them that the human one must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Jesus said this all quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And then in chapter 9, the disciples and Jesus went on from there and passed through Galilee. He didn't want anybody to know it, for he was teaching his disciples. So he said to them, "The human one is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. And finally, at the end of chapter 10, the disciples and Jesus were on the road again, going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was happening to him, saying, "Look, we're going up to Jerusalem. The human one will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They'll condemn him to death. Then they'll hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, spit on him, and flog him, and then kill him. But after 3 days, he will rise again." One of my favorite theologians is Stanley Hauerwas, and he can name the date. He says it was a Sunday evening in June of 1963 that Christendom died. And he explains that what happened that night is that the local movie theater showed a John Wayne movie, and he and his friends snuck out of his church youth group and went to the movies instead. It was the night that Christendom died. And it's kind of been falling apart ever since. Actually, it started a lot earlier than that. Christendom began to deteriorate. In fact, one of my predecessors in the 19th century, Arthur Crosby, he preached a sermon in which There was a great deal of consternation about what it meant to keep the Sabbath. I mean, was it okay after church, never mind during church, but was it okay after church to take a walk on a Sunday afternoon so that you could experience nature and enjoy its fruits? Okay, it was, Crosby, because this pulpit has always been a liberal pulpit, he thought that was a fine idea. But there you go. It's sort of a slippery slope from there to soccer. Think about it. I have a cousin who's a pastor, and he never says soccer. He always says the demon soccer. Because soccer has somehow taken over the lives of our young children. I mean, society doesn't support the idea that people should go to church anymore. Let's face it, we don't have any clout. Used to be the Presbyterian Church and maybe the Episcopalian Church were right in the center of town next to City Hall. The people that worked in City Hall were the same people that ran the Presbyterian and the Episcopalian Church. I mean, we used to have clout. You could make things happen. That's why we had blue laws. Somehow there was a sense in which they thought that we ought to have laws that supported Christendom, that supported the values, let's say, of Christianity. Of course, not all the values of Christianity. We all have our particular filter when we figure out what the values are, but they had clout for quite a while. But now, just not so much. We were talking about it at session the other night. We're dealing with the fact that the sociological pressures on the church mean that there is no expectation that our children will come to church, no expectation that you all will come to church. We're trying to figure out how often people come. I mean, we have some regular attenders, but a lot of people come once every 4 weeks, something like that, because there's no expectation in the society that you should. I'm not even saying it's bad, okay? Just saying it is. The other thing that seems to have come apart in the process is a sense of our communal, let's call it dedication to spiritual practice and spiritual life. When I was growing up, I went to my grandmother's house, and every single morning we had family devotions. We read a Bible story, we read a paragraph about what it meant, then we literally got down on our knees and we prayed together. Right? That was how my father grew up. It's not how he brought me up, though. Slippery slope again. You know, I was encouraged to have private devotions, but somehow, I don't know, I never did develop the discipline the way some of my friends do. So it's not the center of our lives anymore. You know, our faith just sort of, over a period of time, Christendom, its expectations just start to deteriorate. And the other thing that's really been lost is any sense of a unique Christian ethic. I mean, for goodness sakes, do we think anything is right and anything is wrong? Are we willing to say so? I mean, part of the problem with this is, of course, that the ethic of my great-grandfather isn't exactly the ethic that we think is right today. All the debates about human sexuality have put us in a pretty awkward position. We're kind of afraid to say something is right or something is wrong. Kind of afraid to suggest that our call to faith calls us to something greater. And so our society kind of looks at the church as being judgmental, but judgmental about what? I was in the bagel shop again not too long ago, and I saw this, I think she was an 8th grade girl, something like that, absolutely gorgeous, except for the fact that she looked like a hooker. All right? I mean, she looked like a streetwalker. It was ridiculous, the skirt she had on. And she was with her mother. I mean, here you have this extraordinary beauty and this objectification of it and this loss of something valuable in the process. And I didn't say anything. What might I have said? I'm so sad. Wouldn't have wanted to be moralistic. Wouldn't want it to be judgmental. Just an I statement of what I think is beautiful and what I think sullies it. Wonder if all of us did that kind of thing, if maybe it would seep into society a little bit. Maybe things would change, but the church, we don't have much of an identity, because the only identity we really have come from what we call Christian leaders, and we know what they're like. They get on TV and they scream and yell. They talk about how everything's going to hell in a handbasket. They're not us, right? And so we actually have gotten to the point in this congregation, a number of us would rather not identify ourselves as Christian. You know, when I go out into the world and somebody asks me what I do, oh, I'm so tempted to say, well, I engrave stock certificate plates. Because the hostility that comes at you when you're a Christian pastor is kind of remarkable. Because Christian pastors, you know, they come just above car salesmen on surveys, what people think. That's the way it is now. It's really deteriorated. It used to be that pastors, religious leaders were respected, held on high. I mean, you know who John Mackay is? John Mackay was the president of Princeton Theological Seminary in the 50s. And he raised some money one day and was able to take out a full-page ad in the New York Times to absolutely slam McCarthyism. It was quite a moment. But he was a household name at that time. People knew who he was. I'm just curious, excuse me, how many people here know the name of the president of Princeton Theological Seminary now? Okay, one person knew at 8:30. It's my wife. His name's Craig Barnes, just so you know. Really, the church has completely lost its influence. It's like Christendom has died and the leadership seems to have died with it. I mean, so often when you think clergy, what you think is sexual abuse. And why not? I read a survey this week that absolutely knocked me out. 33% of my colleagues said that they have been engaged in inappropriate sexual contact with a church member. 1/3. I mean, car salesmen were that high? It's distressing. And I wonder what Jesus would say about this. What would Jesus think about the fact that Christendom is coming apart, that it's unraveled? And I think what these texts would say is that Jesus would think something like this: have you no ears to hear? Have you no eyes to see? You have distorted the message of the cross from the very beginning. Distorted it to the point that it is not recognizable. Leadership. My goodness gracious, what you call leaders were people that were lifted up on high, that sought influence and power. That's not the way of the cross. Jesus would say, that's not the way of the cross. If we're interested in figuring out how to be followers of Jesus now, no, you focus on servant leadership. Makes me wonder about how I lead this church. You know, why is it, for instance, that I want this church to grow? Well, one of the reasons that I want it to grow is so that a lot of people will feel the impact of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is to say, the hope that after death comes new life. That if we open up our hearts and allow the creative power of God to come through, it will come through the death into new life, and there is hope for this world. That's why I want a lot of people here. Except that a lot of the time, that's not why I want people here. I want people here so I'll look successful. Okay? I have an ego. I have wounds from youth like everybody else, all right? And so it plays out for me too. How about the elders of the church? Or really, everybody's an elder in this church, so how about all of you? You know, I can't remember the last time I had a conversation about church growth that was not in the context of how many members can we get so we can balance the budget. And Jesus would say that's simply not the kind of way of the cross. That's an effort to stay alive. That's not a willingness to go through death to move into new birth. And how about this ethic? Could we come to a point where we could get clear about what is right and what is wrong so that we could speak I statements about what we believe the love of God is doing in this world? Can we speak with a clear voice? Or every time we speak, do we think it means that, well, somebody may tell me I've got to do something better? All this judgment that comes in. It's how the community used to operate. It was all about judgment. People put you down if you didn't live up to a particular set of standards. Jesus would say, I mean, it's no wonder that the church is dying. No wonder that Christendom is coming apart. You distorted the message from the very start. It's never been about judgment. It's always been about moving into new life, which means giving up something of who you are. Can we come to a new ethic? Can we speak with a clear voice in the world? Sure, about sex, about the nature of relationship as human beings giving to one another in such a way that each person becomes more of themselves, not less. Have you ears to hear, have you eyes to see, is I think what Jesus would say. It's no wonder that things are declining. And political power. How is it that the church expresses its political power? Is it the way of the cross? You've heard me speak about the Marin Organizing Committee. You know what? I've never been really clear to you about what it is that bugs me. Right? I'm ambivalent because on the one hand, I hear stories about groups from the Marin Organizing Committee doing a lot of research about homeless shelters and going to the county supervisors and telling them what they found and making suggestions for what might come next. And the supervisor welcoming the conversation, having a lot of questions about what might happen next. And then the people go away and they do more research, come up with other ideas, and they work in concert with the supervisor until they begin to come to a solution together. That is the way of the cross. Serving other human beings, finding a way through, being creative, letting the Spirit work in those ways. But then I hear about rallies that are essentially about manipulating politicians, putting them in a position where they have to say yes to whatever MOC's agenda might be. And that is definitely not the way of the cross. How will we express our political power if we are to walk the way of the cross? It's really hard to take because I don't know about you, but I think if I express it through love and, communion and trying to convince people in a way that's constructive for everybody, I'm not sure we're going to get where we want to get that way. It could be that we won't get done what we want to get done. And Jesus would say, yeah, and that's why the church is declining. Because the trust does not fall on the power of God to bring new life where there is disaster. To bring new program where everything else has crumbled in front of it. The way of the cross is an extraordinary challenge. It's unpleasant. It sometimes doesn't make any sense to us. I hear people tell me all the time that they don't believe in, sort of the magic God. They certainly don't believe in any kind of exclusive Christianity, nothing like that. But they think that Jesus is worth following. Jesus tells us to love one another. Well, when Jesus said that, what he meant was the way of the cross. What he meant was giving up your life, maybe even for real, so that some new, fresh thing can take hold somewhere, because that's what the Spirit does. So I'm not crazy about these texts. But we're going to stick with them because there they are, asking us to ponder and to think, to be challenged by these stories. From now to Palm Sunday, we'll walk through the texts that exemplify political power as seen through the eyes of the way of the cross. We'll talk about the nature of community, its nonviolent nature from start to finish. The way of the cross. We'll talk about the nature of human leadership through the way of the cross that carries out to new hope and possibility. And the reason we're going to do it is because we're not always aware of what we're doing. I'm struck by the fact that I am looking at a group of wonderful human beings, and I'm not kidding. You are, as a group, generous, willing to work for other people. You are kind. Most of you are hopeful. The rest of you are realistic. Great group of people. But even then, somehow we don't take a look at ourselves. We don't make the subject self. We don't pull it out here and make it an object. So we can see who it is that we are and what it is that we're doing. And that's why we have the stories of Scripture to bump up against. So over the next weeks, we're just going to take a look at ourselves. And believe me, this is not a self-righteous move. I got to look at myself as much or more as any of you. Look at it so we can make changes to it. What's at stake is not the church. Will this help us grow? I don't know. Jesus really wouldn't care. He'd be interested in whether or not we can live the way of the cross. Whether or not we can look at ourselves and make changes so that we are living out the wonderful hope of the power of God that comes from death to new life. Each one of you has the living power of the Christ within. Each one of you has a unique way of expressing it into the world. If we can get out of the way of ourselves, be filled with the courage of the Spirit, then something fresh, new will happen. And we will know that we have been touched by the power of God.